First story, the case of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, Mississippi Desert, 1973. I still remember the way the water looked that night, black, still reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of polished glass. Calvin and I had been out there for hours, barely speaking, just enjoying the quiet. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, just fishing, just two men trying to escape the weight of everyday life. But I swear to God, if I'd known what was coming, I would have run. I would have left that damn place and never looked back. The first thing that changed was the air. It got heavy, like before a storm, but worse. Like something was pressing down on us, squeezing the breath out of my lungs. Then out of nowhere there was this light so bright it burned my eyes even when I shut them. I thought maybe it was a helicopter at first, maybe the police. But there was no sound, no blades chopping the air. Just this unnatural, suffocating silence. Calvin dropped his rod, frozen like a deer in headlights, and I felt my own body lock up. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I wanted to move, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. And then they came. I don't know how to explain what they looked like without sounding crazy. They weren't little green men, and they weren't those big-eyed things you see in movies. They were tall, taller than me, maybe 7 feet, and their skin was this weird, rubbery gray, like they weren't made of flesh but something else. Their hands. Christ, their hands didn't have fingers the way ours do. They were more like pincers, sharp and unnatural, and when one of them touched my arm, I thought my skin was going to crawl right off my bones. I don't remember walking toward the light, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was off the ground, floating, weightless. I could hear Calvin breathing hard beside me, but neither of us could scream. Something had taken control of our bodies. I was trying to fight it, but it was like being wrapped in invisible chains. The light swallowed us whole, and for a brief moment I swear I felt my heart stop. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. Could have been seconds, could have been hours. Time didn't feel real anymore. When I came to, I was lying on something cold, like a metal slab, but smoother than any metal I'd ever touched. It felt almost like glass, but there was a warmth to it, like it was alive somehow. My head was spinning, my vision blurred, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could hear this strange rhythmic hum, low, mechanical, almost like a deep vibration that I could feel in my bones. My body was still frozen, like I was paralyzed, but my mind was awake, screaming. The room around me was dim, bathed in this eerie bluish-white glow that didn't seem to come from any particular source. The walls weren't walls at all, at least not in the way we understand them. They were smooth, seamless, curving in ways that didn't make sense, like the whole place was carved out of a single piece of something unnatural. There were no sharp angles, no corners, just an endless, cold smoothness. Then I saw them again. 3 of them, moving slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world. Their skin looked even stranger under the artificial light, like wet stone, rough yet somehow elastic. Their heads were elongated, almost bulbous, but it was their eyes that haunted me the most. Deep-set, black as oil, no whites, no pupils, just endless darkness that seemed to pull me in, to see straight through me. And then, before I could even process what was happening, one of them leaned over me, and something sharp pierced into my forearm. The pain was instant and overwhelming, like liquid fire spreading through my veins. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't work. My body betrayed me. I couldn't move, couldn't fight back. All I could do was lie there, helpless, as they began their work. I could feel everything. That's the worst part. I wasn't unconscious, wasn't numb. I was aware. Every touch, every probe, every violation of my body, I felt it all. They didn't talk, at least not in any way I could understand, but I knew they were communicating. There was this pressure inside my skull, like someone whispering directly into my brain without using words. It wasn't a voice, not really, more like impressions, waves of meaning being forced into me. They were studying me, inspecting me, like a butcher inspecting livestock before the slaughter. One of them held a device, small, metallic, with thin, needle-like appendages that moved on their own, flexing and twitching like the legs of a spider. It hovered above my chest, and before I could brace for whatever was coming, the needles plunged into my skin. I felt them sink deep, deeper than should have been possible, sliding between muscle and bone as if my body was nothing more than soft clay. My vision exploded into white-hot pain. It was like my insides were being rewired, like they were mapping every inch of me from the inside out. My ribs burned, my stomach convulsed, but my body still wouldn't obey me. The paralysis kept me pinned down, reduced me to nothing more than an experiment on a table. And then, as quickly as it started, the device pulled back, the needles retracting, leaving behind nothing but a dull, radiating ache. I could hear Calvin somewhere nearby, whimpering, his breathing shallow and erratic. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him we'd get out of this somehow, but I knew I'd be lying. There was no escape, not from them. When they were done with the device, they turned their attention to Calvin. I don't know how I knew it, but I felt the shift. The air seemed to tighten around me, as if everything in that cold, dark place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could hear him struggling, though it was weak and distant, muffled like his cries were coming from underwater. I tried to move again, but nothing worked. My arms felt like lead, and my legs, despite all my will, refused to respond. The only thing I could do was watch. It felt like hours, though I know it couldn't have been. The lights in the room flickered, growing brighter and dimmer in a way that made me dizzy. One of the aliens, if that's what they were, stepped toward Calvin, its eyes fixed on him. I saw the way he trembled, his body shaking in a way that made my own skin crawl. Then it happened. The alien reached out, its hand hovering just over his face, and suddenly he froze, completely still. I watched as the creature's fingers, those horrible pincer-like fingers, hovered above his forehead. I don't know what it did to him, but the moment it touched him, he went limp. I could see the life drain from him. It was like watching someone suffocate in slow motion. The air around him thickened, and I could feel the pressure in my chest grow heavier with every second. I wanted to scream, but the paralysis wouldn't let me. All I could do was stare at my best friend, my fishing buddy, slipping away before my eyes. And then, it was like everything just snapped. 1 second, I was locked in that place, bound to the table, and the next, I was falling through empty air, weightless, like I was being sucked back into reality. I gasped, my lungs burning, and the world around me popped back into focus. But it didn't feel real. The ground beneath me wasn't the hard, smooth metal I'd been lying on. No, it was soft, damp grass, cool to the touch. I blinked, disoriented, and the first thing I noticed was the pain. My entire body ached, like I'd been beaten and left to rot. I could still feel the alien's touch on my skin, the cold fingers lingering on me, even though I was back on solid ground. And the light, that same blinding light, was gone. It was just the dark sky now, full of stars. The silence felt deafening, and I realized I was outside. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all I saw was the same stretch of black, empty sky and the faint glow of the distant moon. Calvin was gone. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was still out there somewhere. It didn't take long for me to notice the strange marks on my body. Lines, grooves, like something had carved into my skin. They were red and swollen, like a rash, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I reached up to touch my neck, feeling the raised scars, and then I saw it. The thing that made me believe, made me know this wasn't some fevered nightmare. There, on my wrist, was a small, dark, circular bruise. It wasn't from any injury I could remember. It wasn't something I'd done. But it was there, a symbol of whatever had happened, whatever I'd just been through. I remember the cold sweat that broke out across my body as I stood up, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was still trying to catch up with my body, still too disoriented to think clearly. The night was dead quiet, not even the usual sounds of crickets or rustling leaves, just that suffocating, empty silence. It took a few moments before I realized I wasn't alone. There were figures moving in the distance, barely visible against the backdrop of the night, but I could tell they were there. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were the same creatures, the same things that had taken me. My heart hammered in my chest, and my legs began to give out beneath me. I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was going, but I knew one thing. I had to find Calvin. I had to get out of that place before they came back. I don't know how long I walked, but everything felt wrong. The stars above weren't shining the way they should. It was like I was staring at a warped reflection, like something in the universe had been shifted off course. I called out for Calvin, but my voice was weak, distant, swallowed by the nothingness around me. There was no response. It was like the world had swallowed him whole. Every step felt heavier, the air more oppressive. I could still feel the alien touch on my skin, still feel the weight of what had been done to me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that I hadn't even been thinking about the possibility of it being a dream. I wasn't hoping it was a nightmare. I had already accepted that it wasn't. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I stumbled back to the spot where we'd been fishing earlier. The boat was still there, bobbing gently in the water, the cool glow of the moon reflected off the surface. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me as I approached it. The familiarity of the place should have been comforting, but instead, it only made everything worse. I scanned the area, half expecting to see Calvin, but I didn't. My mind was racing. I kept thinking, maybe he was out there somewhere, maybe he'd made it, maybe he'd seen something too. But when I called his name again, there was nothing. The silence swallowed my voice whole. That's when I felt it. A sharp, cold sensation creeping down my spine, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, my pulse spiking, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty, dark space. But then I noticed it. A figure standing at the edge of the water, just far enough for me to see the outline. It was tall, humanoid, its body glowing faintly like it was made of the same light that had surrounded us before. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, but this time I didn't feel the same terror. It wasn't the same cold, paralyzing fear I'd felt before. This time it was different, more like resignation. I didn't know why, but I felt calm, almost like the thing in front of me wasn't a threat. I don't know how long we stood there, but when I blinked, the figure was gone, and I knew it had never been human. It wasn't anything of this world. By the time I realized what had just happened, I was already back in town, though I don't remember the drive. The only thing I could focus on was the pain, the deep, relentless ache that seemed to emanate from every fiber of my being, like something had been torn out of me, something vital, something I couldn't name. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, the cold metal slipping between my fingers as I unlocked the door to my house. I don't know why I even went back there. It didn't feel like home anymore. The walls felt alien, the air stifling. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but I couldn't. I couldn't put into words what had happened to me. How do you explain to someone that your body has been violated in ways that aren't human? How do you explain the horror of seeing someone take you, drag you into the air and do things to you that no one should ever have to endure? I couldn't even understand it myself. My reflection in the mirror was the first thing that struck me when I walked inside. My face was pale, like I hadn't seen the sun in years. My eyes were sunken, the bruises on my wrists darker now, but the worst part, the part that sent ice through my veins, was the look in my eyes. I didn't recognize myself. I didn't feel like the same man who had gone out fishing that evening. Something in me had shifted, and I couldn't shake it. It was like they had taken something more than my dignity. They had taken my sense of self and left me hollow. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, images of what had happened. The needle-like devices, the dark eyes, the feeling of being dissected. I couldn't stop seeing Calvin, his lifeless body, his face frozen in that expression of fear and confusion. I tried to reach out to him, to connect, but the distance between us was like a chasm I couldn't cross. When I finally managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, I was jolted awake by a sound, no, a feeling, like a whisper just at the edge of my consciousness. Something calling my name. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just the same quiet, empty space. But then I remembered something, the mark on my wrist. I had been so focused on everything else, I hadn't really looked at it until then. It was still there. That dark bruise, the one that had shown up right after the abduction. But it wasn't just a bruise anymore. It had changed. It wasn't circular anymore. It was more like a shape now. A symbol. Something alien. And for the first time since that night, I felt the panic surge again. I ran to the bathroom, staring at the reflection in the mirror, as if that could make it all go away. But no amount of staring at my own face would erase what had been done. That mark, that symbol. I knew it was there for a reason. I knew it wasn't just some random injury. It had to mean something. And that's when the true terror set in. I wasn't the same. I hadn't been the same since I left that damn craft. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one dragging on in a haze of dread and confusion. I tried to talk to people about what happened. Hell, I even went to a doctor to make sure I wasn't physically damaged in some way. But how do you explain something like that to someone who thinks you've just lost your mind? I couldn't even bring myself to tell my family, not really. What would they say? What could they say? How do you explain that you were taken, abducted by beings from another world, that they did things to you, things that you can't even begin to describe, without sounding insane? So I kept it to myself, trying to hold on to whatever shred of normalcy I could. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was normal. My sleep was disturbed by the same nightmare, over and over again. Them coming for me, dragging me back onto that table over and over, each time more invasive, more terrifying. Every time I woke up, drenched in sweat, heart racing, I would feel the weight of their eyes on me, that deep, penetrating gaze that stripped me bare. I would get up, looking for some kind of comfort, but it never came. The nights grew colder, and I could feel myself becoming more and more distant from everyone around me. I couldn't even explain it to myself, let alone to anyone else. I was becoming a shell of the person I once was, hollowed out by the events that had transpired. And then, one evening, it happened again. I was sitting on my front porch, staring into the night, trying to clear my head when the lights appeared again. At first I thought it was just a plane or a helicopter passing overhead, but no, this was different. The light was too bright, too focused, like a spotlight searching for something. I could feel my blood run cold as it hovered there in the sky, motionless, watching me. It was the same light that had surrounded us that night in the desert. My mind screamed for me to move, to get inside, to hide, but I couldn't. I was frozen again. This time it wasn't a physical paralysis. No, this was different. This was something deeper. My legs felt like lead, my arms wouldn't move, and all I could do was sit there, staring up at it, my breath shallow and ragged. It was like the air itself was pressing against me, pushing me down, forcing me to stay still. I tried to look away, to run, but it was like the light was in me, through me. I couldn't escape it. I don't know how long I sat there, helpless. But eventually the light blinked out, vanished just like it had before. The silence that followed was unbearable. My heart felt like it was about to explode in my chest, and I sat there in that dead stillness, barely breathing, and that's when I realized they were watching me. They had never stopped watching me. They were waiting for something, waiting for me to break. I don't know what they wanted from me. I don't think I'll ever understand. But it became clear that whatever was happening wasn't over. It wasn't just a one-time thing, a random event that I could try to forget. It was a cycle. It was like they were studying me, seeing how far they could push me, how much they could break me. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and paranoia. I stopped going out at night. I stopped doing anything that made me feel normal, because normal wasn't real anymore. I spent my days in a daze, walking around, not really existing, just going through the motions. And then there was the phone call. The one I had been dreading since the moment I realized I wasn't the only one. It was Calvin. I knew it was him before he even said a word. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. But I could hear the fear in it, the same fear that had lived in me since that night. He wasn't the same either. He sounded like a shell of himself, just like I did. We didn't even have to speak much. We both knew what had happened. We both knew what we had gone through. And somehow, without even saying it, we both understood that the worst was yet to come. The phone call ended abruptly, but I didn't feel relief. No, that call only solidified everything for me. We were in this together, but we were also Alone. Alone in ways I couldn't explain. Alone in ways that scared me more than the aliens themselves. That night, the dream came again. Only this time, it was different. They weren't just coming for me, they were coming for us. The dream started like it always had, me on that table, surrounded by those cold alien eyes. But this time, I could see Calvin beside me. His eyes were wide with terror, but he wasn't struggling. It was like he had accepted it, like he had become one of them in some sick, twisted way. And then, the worst part came. A voice. A voice that wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense. It was like it echoed inside my head, a cold, metallic sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't speaking words. It was speaking concepts, images, feelings. It was telling me, showing me what had happened that night and what would happen again. We were part of something now. We weren't just victims of their experiment. We were chosen for a purpose I couldn't comprehend, a purpose that no one could understand until it was too late. I woke up with my body soaked in sweat, heart pounding, breath coming in shallow gasps. The terror from the dream lingered, thick and suffocating, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me like I had never felt before. But what scared me the most wasn't the dream itself. It was the certainty that it wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to wrap my head around everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than anything I had already experienced. It wasn't just the abduction that haunted me now. It was the thought that it was still happening, that they were still out there, watching, waiting. I started to feel like I was losing touch with reality, like the world around me was dissolving, and I was slipping through the cracks. Calvin stopped calling. I tried reaching out to him, but his phone went straight to voicemail every time. I didn't know what to do, so I did what I always do when things get too overwhelming. I shut myself in. I stopped talking to anyone. I stopped going to work. I just stayed home, pacing, waiting. But the worst part wasn't the isolation. It was the feeling that I was being pulled somewhere, pulled into something I couldn't escape from. There was a pressure on me, like I was being watched. Not by the aliens, not by anything that made sense, but by something else, something worse. I could feel it, like a cold hand on my shoulder whispering in my ear. And that's when I realized the fear wasn't just inside me anymore. It had taken root in everything I did. It had become a part of me, like a disease. And the worst part, I had no way of stopping it. It stopped as suddenly as it started. One day the lights didn't appear. Calvin didn't call anymore, and I stopped hearing that strange echoing voice in my dreams. It was like they had vanished, leaving me in the dark to figure out what had happened. I tried to go back to normal, tried to push it all down and forget, but I couldn't. The scars were still there, deep inside me. The mark on my wrist hadn't faded. I could still feel it, the weight of it, as if it was branded into my skin. And Calvin, he never came back. I don't know where he is, but I think about him every day. I think about what they did to him, what they did to us. I wonder if it was all part of some bigger plan. Maybe that was the point, to leave us broken, to make us question everything. I still don't know if I'll ever get the answers I need, but I do know one thing. Whatever happened that night, it changed me. It changed us. And now, every night when I lay in bed, I can still feel their eyes on me. watching, waiting for something I can't understand. Maybe it's not over yet. Maybe it never will be. And maybe, just maybe, they'll come for me again. I don't know. But I'll be ready. Or at least, I think I will. Second story. The case of Travis Walton, Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, Arizona, 1975. I never thought I'd be writing this, much less sharing it online. But here I am. It was just another day in the woods, working with my crew, cutting trees in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. It was dark, but not too late, around 6 p.m. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and the job was going smoothly. We were finishing up our day when something happened. I didn't even notice at first, just thought it was a light, maybe someone coming up the trail. But then it got too bright, too focused. I looked up and that's when I saw it. A light, like nothing I had ever seen before. A beam shining straight down at me. My body froze, I couldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or just something else, something I can't describe. But I felt like I wasn't in control of myself anymore. That light, it didn't feel right. And then I blacked out. When I woke up, I wasn't in the woods anymore. It didn't make sense. I wasn't even sure where I was. The air felt different, colder, somehow sterile. I tried to move, but my body was weak, like I hadn't slept in days. My head throbbed, and the walls around me looked like nothing I had ever seen before. Everything was smooth, metallic, and there were these strange symbols I couldn't understand. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming, or maybe I was just hurt really bad and hallucinating. But then I saw them. Figures standing at the edges of the room. They were tall, thin, and wrong. Their eyes were huge, dark, like they could see straight through me. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream. It felt like the air was being sucked out of my lungs, and all I could do was stare at them. I don't even know how to explain it, but everything in that place felt wrong. Like I was in a nightmare, only it wasn't just in my head. It was real. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was this humming sound in the background, constant and low, like the whole place was alive. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of rubber. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry and I couldn't make a sound. The figures, those beings, were still there, watching me. Their eyes, it's like they were searching for something, scanning me, but not in a way that made sense. I could see their faces, their features, but it was like they weren't really there, like they were a part of the darkness itself, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. I tried to focus to make sense of what was happening, but nothing seemed real. The room, if it was even a room, was so strange. The walls didn't have corners, just smooth curves, as if I was inside something. Alive. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I didn't want to look away from them. I couldn't tell if they were moving closer or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But I swear, one of them reached out to me, its long, slender hand coming towards me. And that's when I felt the fear take over. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, but something deeper, something primal. My heart raced, my chest felt tight, and then just as fast as it all started, everything went dark again. I don't know how long I was out this time, but when I woke up, I was back in the woods. At least, I think it was the woods. My vision was blurry, my body aching, and my head felt like it was about to explode. It was like the world had shifted, like I'd stepped back into reality. But it wasn't the same. I couldn't remember how I got there, couldn't remember what had happened to me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no wind in the trees, just this heavy silence pressing down on me. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My hands were trembling, and I could barely lift my head. The first thing I noticed was the sky. It was darker than it should have been, as if time had skipped, or maybe I had lost time. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but it didn't feel right. The trees looked different. The shapes in the distance weren't what I remembered. Something had changed, and then it hit me. The fear. The overwhelming, suffocating fear that I wasn't supposed to be there. That I wasn't alone. I could feel it, like a presence in the air, watching me, waiting. I had to get up. I had to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My mind was racing, but my body was still frozen in that moment. The more I tried to move, the more I felt like I was trapped. Trapped in the woods, trapped in my own skin, and trapped in whatever hell those things had put me through. It felt like hours had passed, but it could have been minutes. Time had become this blurry thing I couldn't trust. I somehow managed to get to my feet, stumbling like a newborn, my knees buckling under my weight. I kept looking around, but everything seemed foreign, like I wasn't even in the same place anymore. The trees, they weren't the same trees. The landscape was off, the sky too dark, like it was in a constant state of twilight. I knew I had to get out of there, but the forest itself seemed to be closing in on me. I could feel it, like the ground beneath me was pulling me back. I pushed myself harder, moving in a direction I hoped was the way I had come, but it felt wrong, like I wasn't walking on solid ground anymore. I could hear things now, faint rustlings in the trees, and not just the usual sounds of nature. There was something else, something I couldn't explain. It was the sound of movement, but not from animals. It was like footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if it was real, but I knew one thing. Something was following me, something that wasn't human. I tried to convince myself it was just the paranoia setting in, but deep down I knew. I wasn't alone. I couldn't outrun it, but I had to try. I didn't know how long I had been walking or stumbling, really. Every step felt heavier, like the very air was pressing down on me. It was almost like the forest was shifting, stretching, pulling me deeper into it, as if trying to keep me from leaving. I could hear the rustling again, closer this time. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I wasn't just being paranoid. I turned around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me, but there was nothing, just shadows, deep and suffocating, curling around the trees. That's when I saw it. A light. A faint glow through the trees. My first instinct was to run toward it, thinking it could be someone, anything that could help. But the closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't a light like I knew. It wasn't a flashlight or the glow from a campfire. It was something else. It was cold, unnatural. And as I stepped closer, I could feel it. It wasn't just light. It was energy, like static electricity making my skin crawl. I reached out, my hand shaking, and as my fingers brushed against it, the light flickered, and I heard a sound, high-pitched, almost like a screech, only it wasn't coming from anything human. I recoiled instinctively, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. The light started to pull me in, slowly at first, then faster, as if it were dragging me toward it. I could feel myself being lifted off the ground, my body weightless, like I was being pulled by some unseen force. My heart raced, my chest tight. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed. The more I tried to resist, the stronger. The pull became like something was reaching into me, yanking me through the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything around me blurred. The trees, the forest, even the ground below me, all gone, as if I were suspended in space. The light enveloped me completely, and in that moment I couldn't tell if I was still on Earth or somewhere else entirely. My body felt like it was being stretched, pulled apart in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I could feel every single cell in my body vibrating like the light itself was alive, feeding off me. I wanted to scream, but it was like my vocal cords were frozen, my whole body locked in some kind of paralysis. I could still hear that awful high-pitched screech, but now it was mixed with something else. Voices, low murmurs, incomprehensible, whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were speaking, but not to me. They were speaking to each other, communicating in a language that sounded as ancient as the stars. It was like they were discussing me, analyzing me, deciding what to do with me. But there was no way to fight back. I was nothing but a spectator, in my own body, helpless, being dragged into whatever hell they had prepared for me. The moment I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the light abruptly vanished. The pressure, the pull, everything was gone in an instant, and I fell, hard, back onto the ground. My body slammed into the earth, and for a second, I couldn't move. I lay there gasping for air, trying to make sense of what just happened. My head was spinning, and the taste of metal was thick in my mouth. I didn't know if I was still dreaming or if I had actually been abducted. The word kept flashing in my mind like it was the only thing that could explain what had happened. I slowly pushed myself up, my body aching with every movement. My knees buckled, and I had to brace myself against a nearby tree to stay standing. The forest around me was still quiet, unnaturally still, but now everything felt wrong. I felt it in my bones. The heavy presence again. Something was watching me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I couldn't explain how, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could hear the faintest scrape of footsteps, like something or someone was moving just beyond my vision. I had to get out of there. I had to get home. But how could I leave when everything around me had changed? The trees were different. The air felt off. It was like I had stepped into a version of reality that wasn't mine. I felt like an intruder in my own world. And that feeling, that gnawing fear that something was coming for me, that it wasn't over yet, it wouldn't go away. I don't even know how I managed to move, but I kept walking, stumbling, dragging myself through the strange forest. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking on unfamiliar ground, despite it being a place I'd worked in for years. The trees looked twisted now, their shapes too sharp, too angular, as if they were reaching for me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing, just that heavy silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. The rustling was gone, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I swear, I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin was crawling. I kept telling myself I had to get out of there. I had to make it to the truck, to the road, to safety. But the path felt endless, like it was looping, pulling me deeper into the woods, farther from where I knew I should be. And then, in the distance, I saw it again. That light. It wasn't the same as before, but it was unmistakable. Cold, harsh, and bright, too bright. It seemed to come from above like a hovering presence. My heart stopped. I froze. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like my body was betraying me. I could feel it. Something was coming for me. I didn't know how I knew, but I just did. And it wasn't human. The light pulsed. It wasn't constant, but it flickered, almost as if it were alive, breathing, following some strange rhythm that only it understood. It didn't make sense, but nothing in the last few hours had made sense. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight. I took a step back, then another, but the light didn't fade. It didn't move either. It just hung there, suspended in the air, like a star that had come too close. Then, I heard it. A sound, a vibration that came from deep within the earth, a low, rumbling hum that made my teeth ache. The air around me started to feel thick again, like it was pressing down on me. And then I felt it, cold fingers against my skin, like a breeze that wasn't a breeze, but something far colder, something that wasn't supposed to exist. My heart raced as the ground beneath me started to shake. A tremor, subtle at first, but growing stronger. I had no idea what was happening, no idea what was about to happen. But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't alone. The light flared brighter, and I was frozen in place, my body locked in place like some kind of prey. The sound grew louder. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my bones. Whatever it was that was coming for me was close, and I couldn't run. I couldn't even move. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like an eternity. The light, if you could even call it that, was now closer, hovering just above the treetops, bathing the forest in a sickly, unnatural glow. My mind was racing, but there was no clear thought, just panic. My legs felt like concrete, my body stiff with fear. It was as if I had become part of the landscape, frozen in time. The air was suffocating, thick with something I couldn't explain, and the shaking beneath my feet had turned into a steady vibration that I could feel deep in my bones. I tried to take a step, just one, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like I was bound by invisible chains. My breath came in short gasps, my heart pounding in my chest, threatening to burst. The humming noise had turned into a scream, a piercing shriek that rattled my teeth. I wanted to cover my ears, to block it out, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even close my eyes. I was forced to watch as the light grew brighter, swirling, like it was alive, like it was feeding off my terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light blinked out. The sound ceased. The shaking stopped. And for a brief moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. It felt wrong, like the calm before something even worse. I stood there motionless, waiting for the next thing, for whatever it was that was coming next. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't know if I should move, if I could move. My head was spinning, my vision blurry. And then, as if on cue, I felt it. The weight of eyes upon me, cold, calculating, alien. I didn't see them, but I could feel them in every inch of my skin, like invisible hands gripping me. And then, Just as quickly as they had appeared, the fear hit me again. The fear like a tidal wave, crashing over me, swallowing me whole. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. A primal, gut-wrenching terror that had no name, no explanation. It was the kind of fear that you can't run from, no matter how fast you move. It wasn't just fear of what was out there. It was fear of what I was becoming, fear that I was losing myself, that whatever I had been through had changed me. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I stumbled backward, away from the spot where the light had been. But as I turned to run, the world around me seemed to twist. The forest, the trees, everything. It wasn't real anymore. It was like I was in a dream, but the kind of dream that you can't wake up from. The shapes around me began to warp, distorting, stretching, as if the whole world was being sucked into something. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the voice. It wasn't a voice, really. It was more like a thought, a word that filled my mind. Leave. That single word, leave, echoed in my mind, sharper than any scream, louder than any sound I had heard before. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a presence, an intelligence that had somehow invaded my thoughts, demanding compliance. It wasn't like anything I could explain. I felt it deep inside me, in my very soul, vibrating through my chest, making my body tremble with an urgency I couldn't ignore. My body was no longer my own. I felt like a puppet, my limbs jerking, responding to some unseen force. And that feeling of being watched, it was overwhelming now. I couldn't move without feeling eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned quickly, and for a split second I thought I saw something. Figures, shadows flickering just beyond the trees. But when I blinked, they were gone. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the air so cold it burned. It wasn't like regular cold. It was deeper, more unnatural, like the chill from the deepest reaches of space. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me, sinking under my skin, crawling through my veins. The word, leave, repeated in my head, over and over, like a mantra. I had no choice. I had to get away. I had to leave. But every direction I tried to move felt like I was being pushed back, pulled towards something waiting. The woods had become an enemy, a labyrinth, trapping me. I wasn't in control anymore. I don't remember how I managed to get to the truck. Everything after that was a blur, like I was running on pure instinct, fueled by nothing but terror. I remember the key in my hand, fumbling to unlock the door, my fingers shaking so violently I could barely get the ignition to turn. The truck engine roared to life, but it sounded hollow, distant, like the world was muffling everything around me. I slammed the gear shift into drive and sped out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, the engine growling like a beast desperate to escape. I don't know how fast I was going, too fast, but I couldn't stop. The road stretched ahead of me, and yet it felt like I was driving in circles, that I couldn't leave this place, no matter how far I went. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest, the trees thinning out, that I finally started to feel the grip of whatever had been holding me loosen. My hands were still trembling, my whole body still shaking from what I had just experienced, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I just drove. I had no destination in mind, no idea where I was going. I just had to get away from that place, from whatever had found me there. But no matter how far I drove, No matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, that it had followed me. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't until I got home that I realized how much time had passed. I had no recollection of the drive, no memory of how I ended up back in town. But there I was, sitting in my truck, parked in front of my house, hands still clutching the wheel like I was ready to drive off again. I don't know how I managed to get out of the truck, but when I did, everything felt wrong. The air still felt heavy, like it was pressing against me, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light again, that cold, unnatural glow. I could still hear the hum, the vibration deep in my bones. The worst part wasn't the memories, though. It was the feeling. The feeling that something had changed, something inside me that wasn't right. It was like I wasn't the same person anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it deep down. I felt empty, hollow. Like whatever they had done to me wasn't over, that I was still connected to whatever had been watching me, waiting for me to return. The worst part, I wasn't the only one who noticed. My family saw it. They said I looked different, acted different. I couldn't look them in the eye. How could I? How could I explain something like that to them? They thought I was just traumatized. And maybe I was. But there was more. Something I couldn't put into words. The nightmares started the very next night. They were never the same, always different, but always the same feeling. That cold, that suffocating sense of being trapped, of being observed. I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape it. I tried everything, medicine, talking to someone, even going to a therapist, but nothing helped. I wasn't the only one affected. The other men who had been with me that night, they started having problems too. Not just nightmares, but blackouts, gaps in their memories, feelings of dread that wouldn't go away. We all tried to move on, to pretend like it didn't happen, but deep down we all knew it wasn't over. It was like they were still out there watching, waiting for the right time to come back, to take us again. It's been years since that night, but I'm telling you, I know. Whatever happened to me that night wasn't a dream. It wasn't something I imagined. It was real. And every time I close my eyes, I still feel them, I still hear them, and I know that one day they'll come for me again. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the case of Betty and Barney Hill, New Hampshire Wilderness, 1961. It happened so fast. 1 minute we were driving down the road, the headlights cutting through the dark of New Hampshire's desert, and the next, I was frozen, completely still, unable to move or speak. I don't know how it started, but I remember the moment it clicked that something wasn't right. The car was quiet. Too quiet. It was just me and Barney. But the road seemed endless, stretching out forever. The night was too calm, too still. Something wasn't natural about it. I glanced over at Barney, and his face, pale and tense, told me everything I needed to know. He knew it too. I don't remember when the lights appeared. Maybe it was always there, blinking in and out of my peripheral vision. But when I did focus on them, it was like the whole world went still. The lights were so bright, so piercing. I swear they filled the entire sky. At that moment, it felt like the car was no longer moving. We weren't driving anymore. It felt like we were being pulled, held by something outside, something far greater than us. I couldn't make sense of it. The next thing I knew, the car jerked to a halt. It wasn't a smooth stop, no screeching tires or anything like that. It was more like the car had been yanked to a standstill. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Barney was shaking, gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. I felt something too, but I couldn't explain it. A sort of weight. Something in the air was different. And then came the buzzing sound. Low at first, but it got louder, almost deafening. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My body felt numb, like I was no longer in control of it. Barney turned to look at me, but his eyes weren't the same. They were wide, like he was seeing something I couldn't. My chest tightened, a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I wanted to speak, to ask him what was happening, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came. And that's when the lights... I can't even call them lights anymore. They weren't just lights, rushed toward us. They weren't from any ordinary vehicle. No headlights, no shapes I could recognize. The glow was so bright, it blurred everything around it, until it swallowed the car whole. I felt my heart stop. I swear, I felt my heart stop. I don't remember how, but the next thing I knew, I wasn't in the car anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold, sterile, and wrong. The air felt thick, almost heavy, like I was breathing in something that wasn't oxygen. My eyes tried to focus, but everything around me was blurry at first. I could see outlines, shapes, but nothing made sense. It was like being inside a fog, but one that pressed down on you. There was a sharp, metallic smell in the air, like the inside of a hospital, but far colder. And then I saw them. They weren't human, nothing close. The creatures had these dark, almond-shaped eyes, and their skin was a sickly gray, almost translucent. They moved in perfect, synchronized motions, like they were gliding across the ground. My body froze, but my mind screamed. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't move. I wanted to run, but I knew I wouldn't make it. I felt small. I felt so small and insignificant in that moment. The worst part, they were looking at me. I felt their eyes on me, like they were studying me, examining every inch of me. The next thing that happened is something I can barely bring myself to describe. They separated me from Barney. He was still there. I could hear his voice faintly in the distance, but I couldn't see him anymore. My heart dropped. I didn't know where he was. The creatures, or whatever they were, took me by the arms and led me down a narrow hallway, too bright for my eyes to adjust. My feet didn't touch the ground. At least that's how it felt. It was as if they were levitating me, moving me against my will. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight back. I just kept thinking over and over, this isn't real, this isn't happening. But it was. I could feel their cold hands grip me, their fingers thin and unnatural. I wanted to pull away, but my body wasn't responding. And then I saw the table. A cold metal table in the center of the room, illuminated by a bright light above. The moment I saw it, I knew what was coming next. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want any of it. But I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even close my eyes. They placed me on the table. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't rough either. It was like they were simply moving me, as if I didn't matter, like I was a piece of equipment being set into place. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't even blink, without them knowing. As soon as I was on that table, I felt something cold press against my skin. It wasn't physical, not exactly, but it was like a presence, something that crawled under my flesh, making my insides squirm. The room felt like it was closing in on me, but I couldn't move, couldn't even feel my limbs properly. I was conscious, fully aware, but paralyzed. Then came the pain. It started as a dull pressure in my head, like something was pushing into my skull from the inside. But it didn't stop there. My entire body felt like it was being pulled apart, stretched and twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible. I tried to focus on anything, something to hold on to, but the fear was so overwhelming I couldn't think straight. I wanted to scream, to beg for them to stop, but no sound came. The beings moved around me with unnatural precision, and I could feel their gaze on me, every single one of them. Their black eyes bored into me like they were reading my soul. My body shook uncontrollably, but my mind felt trapped in a fog, as if the fear itself was suffocating my thoughts. Every moment dragged on for what felt like hours, though I know it couldn't have been. The lights above me flickered and hummed, filling the space with an eerie, almost mechanical rhythm. It wasn't just a physical pain anymore. It was as if they were digging into my mind, pulling thoughts, memories, emotions from the deepest parts of me. I wanted to fight it, but I couldn't. It was like they were inside me, dissecting me piece by piece, but not in a way that made sense. It was a kind of horror I couldn't describe, a violation beyond what any human could understand. I don't know how long it lasted, but when the pain finally stopped, I thought I was dead. The relief was so overwhelming that I could barely take it in. But I wasn't dead. I was still alive, and the terror hit me all over again when I realized that I had no idea what was happening. One of the creatures stood at my side, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I could feel its presence even though it didn't touch me. My body felt weak, like I had been drained, and my chest tightened with the realization that I was not alone. Not only was I being examined, but my mind was being stripped clean of anything I knew. Memories, thoughts. I could barely remember what I had for breakfast that morning. I could feel the weight of their gaze as if they were digging through the darkest corners of my mind. Everything felt wrong, like nothing was real anymore. Then they began speaking, not in words, but in sounds. I don't know how to describe it. There were no lips moving, no voices. It was like their thoughts entered my mind directly, as if they were communicating with a part of me that wasn't even conscious. The sounds were sharp, alien. I could sense them trying to pull information from me, but I couldn't give them anything. My thoughts were scattered, my mind scrambled. And then, as if they were unsatisfied with the chaos inside my head, the creature's eyes flickered, and I felt an unnatural coldness seep through my chest. I could feel them pushing something into me, into my mind, deeper and deeper. It was a foreign force, like I was being invaded from the inside out. I couldn't scream, I couldn't stop them. All I could do was lay there, paralyzed, with their cold eyes boring into me. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went black. Not a gradual fading, but a sudden, complete absence of all light, all sound. I wasn't even sure I was breathing anymore. The next thing I remember, I was awake, but nothing felt right. The disorientation hit me like a wave. I was back in the car, but it wasn't the same. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and I could taste something metallic in the back of my throat. I turned to look at Barney, who was sitting there beside me, his eyes wide, unblinking. He looked like he had seen a ghost. like he had lived through the same nightmare I had, but he couldn't remember any of it. I reached out to touch him, just to make sure he was real, but my hands felt numb, like I wasn't fully in control of my own body. The road stretched on before us, but the landscape felt foreign now. Nothing like the way it had been before. It was like the whole world had changed, and we had been dropped into some parallel reality where nothing was familiar. The car had been parked on the side of the road, but I had no memory of pulling over, no recollection of anything happening after I had passed out. I glanced at the clock. An hour had passed, but it felt like we had been gone for days. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I wanted to scream, but something deep inside me told me to stay quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I looked out the window expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just the same desolate road stretching out ahead of us. Nothing was right. Everything was wrong. We didn't speak at first. Neither of us could find the words to explain what had just happened. The air in the car was suffocating, and the silence between us was deafening. I remember glancing over at Barney, but he didn't look at me. His eyes were glued to the road, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked like he had aged years in the span of what felt like minutes. I wanted to ask him what happened to us, what they had done to us, but I couldn't bring myself to. Part of me didn't want to know. I was scared of what I might hear. The other part of me, well, I think we both knew we had experienced something that defied all logic. Something that shouldn't be possible. I didn't know what they had done to us, but I could feel it. Deep down, I knew something inside me had changed. We didn't speak of it then, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. The fear, the terror, it clung to us thick and suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see their faces, their eyes, those black, hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for help, but I knew there was nowhere to go. There was no one who would believe us. And the worst part, I still didn't know what had happened to Barney. The thought that they had done something to him too, the thought that they had done something to both of us, made my stomach churn. I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't stop. What had they taken from us? What had they done while we were in that place? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, something inside me, something I couldn't reach. And I was afraid that no matter how much I tried to forget, I would never be able to escape what had happened. The weeks after the incident were a blur, filled with strange dreams and waking moments where I couldn't quite remember if I was still in the car, if I was still on that table, or if it had all been some kind of nightmare. My thoughts felt fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror that I couldn't put together. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, on that cold table under those unforgiving lights, with them standing over me. I could still feel their hands on me, still hear their silent, oppressive presence. I remember one night, barely able to sleep, I decided to call Betty. I had to know if she was going through the same thing, if she remembered anything. But when I called, she was distant, nervous, almost like she was avoiding the subject. She kept telling me that nothing had happened, that everything was fine. But I knew she wasn't being honest. I could hear it in her voice. She was lying. Something was wrong. The worst part, though, when I looked at her face, I saw it. The same thing that was in my eyes, in my soul. A fear, deep and unspeakable. It was as if we had both seen the same thing, experienced the same terror, and yet we couldn't share it with anyone. We couldn't even share it with each other. A month went by, and the nightmares didn't stop. The images of those creatures, their gray skin, their dark eyes, the way they moved, haunted me every time I shut my eyes. But there were other things too. Small details that I couldn't make sense of. I would wake up with strange marks on my skin, bruises, scars that I hadn't seen before. And sometimes, when I looked into the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. My reflection seemed distant, like I was looking at a stranger. The terror I felt was real, too real. There were flashes of memories that would come to me, pieces of the experience that I couldn't explain, couldn't understand. But they were there, deep in my mind, like shadows moving just out of reach. I tried to talk about it with Barney, but he wasn't the same either. His eyes were always distant, lost in thought, like he was trying to remember something but couldn't. The worst part was the blankness. He couldn't remember what had happened, but I could feel it in him. He was carrying it too. We both were, but neither of us could say what it was. Neither of us could find the words to describe the void, the terror that had been implanted in us. It was as if we were both living in a constant state of denial, trying to convince ourselves that everything was okay, that it hadn't happened. But the truth was in the air we breathed, in the way our hearts raced whenever we passed that stretch of road. We had changed, and I don't know if we'd ever be able to go back to who we were before that night. Eventually, we both agreed to see someone who might help us make sense of what had happened. A hypnotherapist, to be specific. I remember sitting in that sterile office, the air heavy with the smell of cleaning chemicals and stale coffee. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to relive any of it, but I had to know. We both had to know. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a gentle smile, was kind enough, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at us. It was like he knew more than he was letting on, like he had seen this kind of thing before. He asked us questions, simple ones, and we answered as best we could, but I could feel the walls of my mind closing in on me. I knew something was wrong. Something was waiting just out of reach. When the hypnosis began, it felt like I was being pulled into a deep, dark place. I could feel myself slipping into that fog again, the same fog that had consumed me during the abduction. I could hear the voice of the therapist in the background, but it was like I couldn't focus on it. I was sinking deeper, deeper into the memory. And then it hit me, like a punch to the gut. The fear, the pain, the creatures, the cold, metallic air. I was there again. I could feel it. My breath caught in my throat and I could hear myself gasp, but I wasn't awake. I wasn't in control. The room around me disappeared, and all I could see was that table. That cold, unforgiving table. I was back on it, but this time I could remember it all. Every single detail. The way the creatures stood over me, silent, calculating. The way I felt, trapped, powerless, like a specimen, a thing to be examined. My body shook as the memories flooded back in full force, and all I could think was, I shouldn't have come here. The therapist was speaking to me, but it didn't sound like his voice. It was garbled, distant, as if I was hearing him from a long way off. The memories didn't stop. They just kept coming, flash after flash. Every piece of the nightmare that I had tried to bury resurfaced, sharper, clearer than before. I could feel their cold hands on me again, feel their thoughts creeping into my mind, trying to make sense of who I was, who I had been. It wasn't just the physical examination I remembered now, it was the interrogation, the silent probing of my mind. The way their eyes searched me for something. I had been afraid, so afraid that I couldn't think, couldn't scream. They didn't speak, not with words, but their presence was overwhelming. They wanted answers, I realized. Answers. I couldn't give them. My mind felt like it was unraveling under their gaze. And then I remembered something else, something that made my stomach drop. They had taken something from me. I wasn't just altered. Something was gone. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it missing inside me, like a hole in my soul. The therapist's voice cut through my thoughts, but it didn't help. I couldn't focus on his words, couldn't hold on to them long enough to understand. I was back in that place, and the terror was so overwhelming that I felt my heart stop. And then, just as suddenly as it started, I was awake. The room was dark. I was shaking. Sweat was pouring from me. The therapist was sitting in front of me, watching me, his eyes wide with concern. But I wasn't worried about him. I was worried about me. I had remembered too much. I had unlocked something that should have stayed buried. As I sat there, drenched in sweat, trying to gather my thoughts, it felt like the room was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe properly. I kept blinking, trying to shake off the memories, but they clung to me like a second skin. It was as if the hypnosis had ripped something wide open in my mind, and now I couldn't close it again. The more I tried to block it out, the more vivid the memories became. I saw their eyes, those black, empty eyes, staring into me as if they were looking into my very soul. I could hear the hum of the ship, faint and constant in the background, like the pulse of something far greater than anything I could understand. I remember trying to scream, but no sound came out. My body was immobilized, unable to move, as though I was trapped in some kind of stasis. I could feel them in me, controlling me, probing my thoughts. It was like they were siphoning pieces of my memory, like they had the power to erase parts of me, things that I couldn't even put into words. There were flashes of images, of machines, cold and sterile, and things I couldn't recognize, but they were real. I knew they were real. I had seen them. But the worst part, I couldn't remember what had happened after the examination. I could feel myself slipping away from that moment, like I was being torn from it against my will. And then, nothing. It was like the memory had been erased from my mind. But I knew it was there. I knew that something had happened, and it was slowly driving me insane. I left that session with more questions than answers. The therapist, though kind, was no help. He couldn't explain what had happened to me, what I had remembered, or how to make sense of it. He told me that memory loss and distorted recollections were common after traumatic events, but I knew better. This wasn't just a trauma, it was something else, something much worse. Barney and I spoke a little after that, but there was nothing to say. He still couldn't remember anything clearly, but I knew he was hiding something from me. I could feel it in the way he looked at me sometimes, like he knew, but he didn't want to say it. I think, deep down, we were both too scared to confront the truth. Because if we did, if we allowed ourselves to really understand what had happened to us, we would have to face the reality that we had been chosen for something. That whatever we had encountered that night was not an accident. and I think that scared us more than anything else. The days blurred together. I didn't go out much. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, on that table, feeling those cold hands on me, hearing the hum of that ship. Sometimes I could still hear it. I could still feel it vibrating in the back of my mind. Every moment of my life became haunted by it. The memories, the images, the feeling of being watched. They never stopped. They never let me go. And the worst part, I don't think they ever will. The fear, the dread was always with me, just waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull me back to that night. I began to isolate myself more and more, sinking into a strange, quiet madness. The nightmares became relentless. There were nights when I couldn't tell if I was asleep or awake, when my reality twisted and merged with the memories of that night. I would wake up with my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find myself still in my own bed. But I could feel them watching me. I could feel their presence, cold, calculated, pressing down on me from all sides. It wasn't just in my sleep anymore. It was in every waking moment, every corner of my house, every shadow in the room. Felt like it was hiding something. I became hyper-aware of every little sound. A creak in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the streetlight outside. All of it became amplified in my mind, until it felt like the whole world was conspiring against me. I could hear their voices, though I knew it wasn't real. They weren't speaking out loud, but I could hear them in my mind. Their thoughts were intrusive, alien, and they lingered like a stain in my consciousness. Sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. My eyes were hollow, and the fear that had once been contained inside me was now spilling over, seeping into every part of my life. I tried to forget. I tried to move on. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape them. The things that had taken so much from me, and I didn't even know what it was. Then one day it stopped, just like that. The fear, the memories, the constant feeling of being watched. Everything. It vanished as suddenly as it had come. I woke up one morning, and it was gone. The weight on my chest lifted. The oppressive silence was broken, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. But I knew, deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had happened to me, to Barney, wasn't something that could just be erased. It had changed us. And though the terror had stopped, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just below the surface, waiting to return, waiting for the moment when I would be vulnerable again, when we would be taken again. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I'm hoping that if I tell someone, anyone, someone will understand. Maybe I'm hoping that by sharing this, I can finally make sense of it. But the truth is, I don't think I ever will. All I know is that the things we saw that night were real. The things they did to us were real. And I don't think I'll ever be the same. Maybe I'll never be able to look at the world the same way again. But one thing is certain. I know the truth now. The truth that no one wants to face. And it will never let me go. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.